Okay, let's talk about the indirect pathway. Now, the indirect pathway is related to inhibition of movement. The direct was the opposite. I used my direct pathway when I want to facilitate movement, but when I want to inhibit movement, I use my indirect pathway. So N. Okay? Now, the indirect pathway, it's kind of basically the same thing, but I add to it my subthalamus. There's a loop that goes to my subthalamus, and the whole purpose of this loop to the subthalamus is to change the output that comes out of GPI. Okay? So let's do what we did last time. Like we said, in this case also, we're dealing with the GPE, external. In the direct pathway, external was overlooked. We didn't use it at all. But in the indirect pathway, it has a job. And basically, the fibers that come out of the striatum in the indirect pathway go to GPE. The striatopyloidal fibers, in this case, terminate in GPE. Okay, and they're inhibitory, because like we said, the rule was all output from the striatum is inhibitory. And just like all output from GPI is inhibitory, as it's the same thing, all output from GPE is also inhibitory. And this is where the loop comes in, where it goes from GPE to the subthalamus. Okay, now, when it comes back to the globus pallidus, it's going to come back as excitatory. Because in this way, I'm going to change, this is where it's different from the direct. The direct was inhibitory, reaching GPI, but in this case, you have excitatory influences reaching GPI. And the output from GPI to the thalamus is still inhibitory, because that is our rule. Okay? And just like before, input from the cortex is excitatory, and input going back to the cortex from the thalamus is also excitatory. Okay, so let's walk through this. Okay, when I have the intention to stop movement, I'm trying to find a color I didn't use. Let's go with brown. When I make the intention to stop movement, so it's gonna come down from my cortex. So this activity, the activity of these fibers will increase when I want to stop movement. And when these increase, that means more stimulation is reaching the striatum, so the output from the striatum is gonna increase. And so the inhibition reaching GPE is gonna increase, which means the output of GPE is gonna decrease, because there's more of an inhibitory effect. More of an inhibitory effect means less coming out. So the activity of these fibers is going to decrease. And because the activity of these decreased and these are inhibitory, that means less inhibition is being exerted on the subthalamus. So the output of the subthalamus is going to increase, because less inhibition is reaching it. And once this is increased, more excitation, more stimulation is reaching GPI. And this stimulation is going to increase the output of GPI. So ultimately, you're going to have a higher inhibitory effect, a greater inhibitory effect on your thalamus. So the output of your thalamus is going to decrease. And once the output of the thalamus is decreased, then no motor activity is going to happen anymore. You're going to stop moving. Okay, so let's run back through it again. You make the intention to stop moving. So activity coming from your cortex to your striatum is going to increase. And once that increases, it means there's more stimulation reaching your striatum. And that means the output of the striatum is going to increase, which means there's a higher inhibitory effect reaching GPE. And that means that the output of globus pallidus external will be less. So the activity of these fibers is going to decrease. And because these are inhibitory fibers, less inhibition is reaching the subthalamus, so the subthalamus is free to exert stimulation onto globus pallidus internal. And then that means the output coming out of globus pallidus internal is going to increase because it's being stimulated by these fibers coming from the subthalamus. And once it increases, it's stopping the thalamus again. And it's going to stop the thalamus from exciting the cortex. So your movement is going to stop. Okay? Now let's add dopamine. Like we said before, dopamine's function is to facilitate movement. Okay, so what does that mean? That means ultimately I want the output from my thalamus to my cortex to increase, because that is what is going to facilitate my movement. Now, in the direct pathway, dopamine acted on D1 receptors in the striatum. In this pathway, dopamine is going to act on D2 receptors. Now, and like we said, D2 receptors are inhibitory. So when dopamine acts on them, they exert an inhibitory action on the striatal fibers. So once dopamine reaches D2, it's going to exert inhibition on the striatopallidal fibers going out of the striatum to GPE. So these fibers right here are going to decrease. Their activity is going to decrease. And once their activity decreases, what does this mean? Less inhibition is reaching globus pallidus external, which means the output is going to increase. Because I don't have anything stopping its way, there's less inhibition. Once this output is increased, more inhibition is reaching the subthalamus, so the output of the subthalamus is going to decrease. And when the output of the subthalamus is going to decrease, then I have less excitation reaching my globus pallidus internal. Less excitation means less output. And less output from GPI means less inhibition reaching the thalamus. Okay? Less inhibition reaching thalamus means that the activity of the thalamus is going to increase. Now, if you're ever confused in the exam, you need to just draw out this again and just keep in mind dopamine is to facilitate movement. So you can just, you know that the last step is going to be increasing this activity here, and you can work your way backwards if you get lost or confused. So just keep in mind dopamine facilitates movement, and it acts on two receptors, either D2 and has an inhibitory effect, and this is mainly with the indirect pathway, or it can act on D1 and have a stimulatory effect, and this is mainly with the direct pathway. Now, what happens when I don't have dopamine? Basically, this facilitation is wrong. In the absence of dopamine, your thalamus is not, the activity of the thalamocortical fibers will decrease, yes, because you have a lot of inhibition reaching the thalamus, and without dopamine you have nothing stopping this inhibition. And so that's what happens when you get Parkinson's disease, because you have difficulty initiating movement because the dopamine is gone. You have nothing facilitating movement, so you end up with rigidity and those sort of things, and difficulty initiating movement. I think that's it, and if anyone has any questions, they're free to ask me whenever they see me, and I hope I cleared up the confusion that I caused in the review session itself. So thank you and good luck.